In the 600th year of Noah's life, the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened. All flesh died that moved on the earth. Only Noah was left, and those who were with him on the ark. The extent of the flood described in Genesis certainly seems to be catastrophic, and for many interpreters, global in its scale. However, if the text was trying to describe a historical global flood, this would have huge implications in geology, especially in relation to the structure of Earth as well as the rock record. Even more so, this interpretation comes into direct conflict with the currently accepted view of an Earth that has developed slowly and gradually over millions of years. This conflict has led many believers to reinterpret the text into something more like a local or regional flood in order to retain the text's historical record. However, a reinterpretation to retain the flood's historicity is not necessary. The scientific model known as Catastrophic Plate Tectonics has been used successfully to show how a global flood could have occurred geologically. This model was developed by a team of 6 PhD geologists, and it focuses heavily on the idea of rapidly moving tectonic plates. To understand how this model works to explain a global flood, we first need to have a basic understanding of how plate tectonics works in general. Based upon what we know of the Earth, our planet's structure is divided into several different layers. These layers are oriented with increasing density, the most dense being at Earth's center. At the center is the inner and outer core. Beyond that is the mantle, a solid layer of rock which at times can behave sort of plastically. Think of it extremely thick putty. It's not a perfect comparison, but you can get the picture. Beyond that is the lithosphere, also known as the crust. The crust is further broken up into two different kinds of crust. Continental crust, which makes up the continents, and oceanic crust, which makes up the ocean floor. A key factor which differentiates the two of these are their densities. Oceanic crust is more dense than continental crust. This means oceanic crust won't float as high as continental crust will on top of the mantle. And this difference is largely due to the minerals and rocks that make up each of these crusts. In fact, the oceanic crust is thought to be made up of very similar or same material as the mantle beneath it, except that the crust is on the outside. It's much colder than the mantle. And since it's colder, it's therefore more dense than the mantle underneath it, giving oceanic crust a tendency to sink back into the mantle. Something else we need to know is that the crust not only sort of floats, but it also moves across the mantle, albeit slowly today. Different sections of the crust are known as plates, and these plates move past one another, they collide into one another, and even sink below one another. This process of one plate sinking below another is called subduction, when a more dense plate will sink beneath a less dense plate. And as oceanic crust sinks, it causes tension on the plate itself, causing it to split and rupture elsewhere. As it pulls apart, new hot magma rises from the mantle beneath it to fill the newly opened space. As it fills the space, it cools and forms new ocean floor. This process is known as seafloor spreading and occurs at a spreading ridge. That was a lot of terminology, but with that in mind, we can better understand the model of catastrophic plate tectonics. We have to understand plate tectonics in general before we can understand a different version of it. Similar to mainstream models, catastrophic plate tectonics begins with one large landmass on Earth. You may have heard it called Pangaea. There seems to be a possible reading of Genesis 1 which could support that idea, but I wouldn't be dogmatic about it. Genesis 1 isn't really trying to discuss continental placement. Geologically, however, Pangaea seems pretty obvious. All the continents fit really well together like puzzle pieces into one large body. Additionally, we know that the Earth started as one large plate, or just one big surface layer around the Earth. Whatever model you subscribe to, that model has to explain how the process of plate tectonics began, because everyone agrees that the Earth would have started as one large layer on its surface. Somehow it had to be broken up. So, what changed? Secular models don't quite have a perfect answer. There are several out there, but this model looks somewhere different. The team of geologists who developed this model looked to Genesis 7:11 to help explain what caused this change. In Genesis 7:11, it states, "All of the fountains of the deep burst forth." The great deep surely is related to the oceans or the seas. In Hebrew, tahom is the deeps, and this is often related to seas or oceans. We'll talk more about the word fountains later. But there is something in the deep waters which cracked open or broke up. And this is why the model looks to the ocean basins for an explanation. It's looking at the oceanic crust. So, with our background and where we started, the model starts with these parameters. One large landmass, one large outer layer or plate, and colder ocean floors than we have today. This last part is key to the whole model. If, at the start, before the flood, the ocean floors are not being recycled and remade as they are today, then they would be fairly cold in comparison today, because today they're still a little warm. New ocean floors being created. Back then, this wasn't happening. So it's been sitting on the bottom of the ocean for a while. It's colder than it is today. And if it's colder, like we talked about earlier, this means it's more dense than it is today. And remember what we mentioned earlier about density. Oceanic crust has a tendency to sink back into the mantle because it has a higher density than the mantle itself. So before the flood, you have this one single layer, this one single plate surrounding Earth, and the oceanic basins are much colder, much more dense, and therefore they have a tendency to sink, and they're waiting for that push for them to start sinking. So the cause of this push is uncertain, but what is certain from the text is that it was ordained by God. As this original cold oceanic crust began to sink back into the mantle, energy was released into the mantle, heating it up. And as the mantle is heated, it weakens and it becomes easier to move or deform, allowing the sinking plate to sink faster. And as it sinks faster, it heats the mantle up even more. The crust starts sinking faster still. And so this becomes a positive feedback loop of rapidly subducting or sinking oceanic crust. And it just keeps going. And so you have a very, very rapid process starting of all of the cold oceanic crust sinking back into the mantle. And so as that's happening at subduction zones, the oceanic crust is subducting back into the mantle. At the newly made spreading ridges where they broke up, you have hot oceanic floor being created rapidly at these spreading ridges. Because as it goes into the Earth at the subduction zones, something has to rise up to fill its space. It's going to retain the same volume. The Earth is going to retain its same volume. Something has to fill that space that's being made. So this entire process, this rapid process of sinking ocean plates and the formation of new ocean plates, it does two very important things. One, as the new hot melt from the mantle rises up from below to fill that gap, it's going to come in contact with that cold ocean water above it. And that water is going to be vaporized. It's going to send huge jets of steam up through the ocean, out of the ocean, and even into the atmosphere. And this water and the vapor that's been ejected up into the atmosphere is going to condense, and it's going to come back down on the Earth as a torrential rainfall. The text says there was 40 days and 40 nights of rain. This is a perfect way to provide it. Remember the word fountains. Can you imagine if Noah caught a glimpse of these jets of steam erupting from the oceans? Fountains of the great deep seems like a pretty good description. And whether it's the word fountain or the headwaters or some kind of vast watery deeps ripping open, I'm sure if you saw this, huge jets of steam, that's a good description of it. Secondly, remember that the new ocean floor is being made rapidly. This means it doesn't have as much time to cool as it does today because it's going at a very slow process. So as soon as the new ocean floor is made today, it rises up and it cools. And then over time, it's going to continue to cool and flatten out. That's what we see today. The spreading ridge is at a point and it slowly cools back down, flattening out along the plateau. But this ocean floor is being created quickly. There's no time for it to cool down and flatten back out. Rather, the new ocean floor would have been very warm, in comparison at least, meaning it is going to not be as dense as it is today. And as we've continued to talk about today, something that is more dense is not going to sink as high. So if it's going to decrease in density, it is actually going to float higher on the mantle. The entire ocean floor, as it's being rapidly remade, is going to rise up in the mantle, meaning the ocean on top of it is going to rise with it. Can you imagine if you had a bowl of water and the bottom of the bowl of water started to rise up? The water is going to overflow the sides of the bowl. And that's exactly what is happening here. You have newly, rapidly formed, warm ocean floor The decreasing density of it is going to cause it to rise up and push all of the oceans on top of the continent. And this, along with torrential rainfall and earthquakes and tsunami waves and hurricanes created by this entire process of subduction and rapidly moving plates and continents, the water would have covered the entire globe. Also, it would have deposited vast amounts of rock and sediment up onto the continents. And beneath all of these torrential rains and increasing floodwaters, the continents are going to be racing along, colliding into one another, forming new mountain belts. It just would have been crazy. Catastrophic is the right word for it. So we've explained how this process started and what's happening during it, but what caused it to stop? Why aren't we all still underwater? Why do our plates move so slowly now? These are great questions. And so when we look at the text doesn't tell us much, only that God sends a wind for the waters to start to abate. But once again, remember density. The difference in density at the beginning between the hot mantle and the much colder ocean floor was the start and the engine of this whole process. It was that contrast in density that caused rapid subduction, rapidly new forming ocean floor. That's what is generating this whole process. Eventually, as this rapid process is going on, all of the original cold ocean floor would have sunk back into the mantle and been replaced with this new, warm, less dense ocean floor. And so the difference in density between the mantle and the ocean floor would have begun to balance out and slow this entire process down. And what we have today is just the vestiges of the process during the flood. It's all slowing down. You don't have that same contrast between a much colder ocean floor and a much warmer mantle. And as the newly formed ocean floor cooled, it would become more dense, right? Because it was the increased temperature that lessened its density. So as it's cooling, it's going to become more dense, and it's begin to return to its normal position that we see today. So instead of pushing the ocean up, it's going to sink back down into the mantle, and the ocean waters that were originally on the continents are going to sink back into the basins. They're going to run off the continents and back into the lowest possible place. And so as it does this, it's going to erode miles of sediment and rock that had been deposited by the beginning of the flood. It's going to form valleys and canyons and even planing many rock surfaces flat that we see today. And after it's all said and done, Earth has been remade completely. And what's even more interesting is that this model has been simulated on a complex computer program known as TERRA. TERRA was developed by Dr. John Baumgardner to develop a better model to see the internal mechanisms of Earth and how it's going to function in its interior, because we obviously can't go down there to see it. So he needed a computer program to simulate this. And so when he plugs in the starting parameters that we talked about of Earth and he pressed play, he watched a global flood play out. The model showed the continents being broken up, the plates moving at rapid speeds, and even matching the current positions that we see them today. So, and before anyone says that this is just a biased program made by a creationist, I thought, well, perhaps, that's a good answer. But what I found is that this program has been used and is still in use by many secular geologists to help them model and understand Earth's internal structure. It's a good program for helping us understand Earth's interior. So, and here, I'll show you. Here are some of the papers and studies I was able to find which utilized TERRA in their experimentation. And there's quite a few of them. I'm sure if you looked, you could find more even than I did. Another prediction that the model makes is that since the original cold ocean floor was subducted back into the mantle so quickly, it should still be relatively cold. In the biblical timescale, it's only been a few thousand years since the flood. It's not going to be enough time for that plate of rock, which is miles and miles thick, by the way. There's not going to be enough time for that to heat up and melt back or assimilate back into the mantle. Well, thanks to a process known as seismic tomography, we can actually see that there are miles thick slabs of rock beneath Earth's surface that are still starkly colder than the mantle is. And like I said, they're miles thick. If it had been millions of years since a slow process of plate tectonics, of this slowly sinking into the mantle over time, we wouldn't expect to still see this stark contrast in temperature. You would see that the plate would have started to warm up, perhaps melt or assimilate back into the mantle. but we don't see that very much. Rather, we still see miles of oceanic plate that is still cold in comparison to the mantle around it. We even see some of these plates sinking all the way to the outer core of our planet. The temperatures and pressure of that area should have assimilated it by now if it's been there for millions of years. So the fact that they're still there and that the temperature is so different, that shows that they were subducted quickly and that they haven't been there very long. Overall, this model successfully explains geologically how God could have used a global flood to destroy his original creation and then remake it with newly shaped continents, new ocean basins. The whole creation would have been made new. It also explains where the water came from, where it went, and how it covered the continents, and why the Earth is the way that it is now. However, like any model, catastrophic plate tectonics is not a perfect one. All models have their problems. So for catastrophic plate tectonics, it's known as a heat problem. The new ocean floor, as it's rapidly created, it would have released a lot of heat. It would have been pumped, that heat would have been pumped into the oceans at that time. And it's enough heat that it could have boiled the oceans, which would have killed all ocean life as we know it. Well, we also know that plenty of ocean life survived. There's a lot of marine animals still in existence today. So it's definitely a problem that needs to be explained. Well, Dr. John Baumgardner, he gives us a possible solution. He suggests that as those jets of steam erupted from the oceans, that the velocity of it being ejected was actually strong enough, going fast enough to leave our atmosphere. And so that would have taken a lot of heat with it. The velocity of the jets would have rocketed into space out of our atmosphere, cooling the oceans enough for much of the life to survive. And I'll link his explanation below, along with his original papers mentioning this model. There's a lot of really good studies for this. And so I'll link that below so you can check it out. But I think that that's a decent answer to where the heat would have gone. Regardless of that, the simulations of this model not only work, but also match up with the small details of the flood the biblical text gives us. And I for one, find this very exciting, especially since mainstream geologists say there's no mechanism or way the Earth could have ever been globally flooded. And as this model shows, that statement's just wrong. If you found this video helpful or interesting, please don't forget to like and subscribe. If you have any questions about this model, or if you think something needs to be explained in a different way, I would be happy to help. I hope this video has blessed you and helped you understand God's creation, his narrative that he's given us in the text, and how he's done these things in such an intricate and wonderful way. I hope it's blessed you, and I hope you have a blessed day. Until next time, friends.